In the spring of 1903, Birmingham newspapers wrote of a man they called Dirty Dick, a nickname so cruel it seemed designed to strip away what little humanity he had left. They said he never washed except when thrown into a cell, that he stank of drink and dirt, and that his life was little more than a chain of arrests. Yet before he became the city's cautionary tale, he was someone's son, a boy once loved and fed beneath a modest roof. His name was Richard Fleming, and his story, like so many of that era, began in the narrow back courts of industrial England, a world built from soot, iron, and survival. The earliest trace of him appears in the census of 1871, a single line inked by a government hand. Richard Fleming, aged 7, living with his parents and siblings in Great Court Brook Street, Aston. The entry seems unremarkable, another child among thousands, but within it lies the faint warmth of a home. His father, John Fleming, was a metal plater, a trade that required skill and precision, part of Birmingham's vast machine of industry. His mother, Catherine, was only 26, caring for Richard and his younger brother, Thomas, in a court that echoed with the clang of hammers and the smoke of foundries. The courts of Aston were tight labyrinths of life, rows of back-to-back houses crammed into the spaces behind main streets, where washing lines fluttered above cobbled alleys and the air carried the thick breath of coal fires. These were the living quarters of the respectable poor, families who worked long hours to keep hunger from their door but retained dignity in their labour. John's steady trade as a plater placed them just above destitution, a fragile rung on the social ladder. The census records Richard's occupation with a single word: scholar. That small detail speaks volumes. It means that he attended school, a privilege only recently made accessible by the Education Act of 1870, which promised basic instruction to every child. For a brief moment, it seemed his path might rise beyond the smoke and the mills. He was a boy with a desk, a slate, and a future. But history, like poverty, is rarely kind for long. The thread that began in Great Court soon frayed. By the time another decade had passed, the next glimpse of Richard did not come from a census, but from the crime columns of the Birmingham Evening Mail. The date was March 25th, 1881. The headline named a 15-year-old, Richard Fleming, of a court in Coleman Street, charged with obstruction in Stevenson Place. The article painted a grim portrait. Richard was among a gang of street boys, barefoot, ragged, selling matches and newspapers, their pockets filled with copper coins won through a gambling game called pitch and toss. When a constable caught them, the magistrate demanded to know where they got their money. The officer's reply was simple and damning. They beg it from passers-by, then gamble with the rest. The Victorian city was teeming with such boys. They haunted corners and alleys, shouting headlines or hawking matches for a penny. To polite society, they were a menace, a swarm of urchins corrupting moral order. To themselves, they were merely surviving, children with no room to grow. The newspaper's tone was pitiless, yet between their lines we glimpse a different truth. At the hearing, Richard's mother, Catherine, appeared in court. She told the magistrate that she sent him out to sell matches, that she could no longer control him. It was not the confession of a negligent parent, but the cry of a desperate one. A few pennies from her son's trade may have kept the family alive, but it cost him his innocence. Poverty had done what prison would later finish. It turned a child into a wanderer. The authorities showed little mercy. An inspector announced that 30 or 40 children, like Richard, would soon be raided and placed in reformatories, state-run institutions meant to correct moral waywardness through forced labour and strict discipline. The idea was to rescue them from bad company. In reality, it severed them from their families and broke their spirit in the name of salvation. When the census taker came again just days later, on April 3rd, 1881, his pen confirmed the magistrate's threat had been carried out. Two separate records survive from that night. The first lists the Fleming home at 56 Court, Coleman Street. John, the father, now worked as a slater, coating roofs with tar and lead, harder, dirtier labour than plating, a hint of decline. Catherine was still there, along with their sons Thomas and a new daughter Rose, aged 8, but Richard's name is missing. The second record reveals why. It places him at the Birmingham Parish Workhouse on Weston Road, a grim brick compound where the destitute, orphaned or idle were confined under the poor law. The entry lists him as a pauper inmate, aged 14. To be called a pauper was a brand of shame. It meant the state had claimed you, body and soul, as the price of your poverty. For a child, once marked as a scholar, it was the end of promise. We cannot know whether his stay there was long or brief, or whether it followed directly from his arrest, but its meaning is clear. Richard had been formally separated from his family and folded into the machinery of Victorian relief, a place where hunger met punishment and compassion was rationed like bread. The poor law treated poverty not as misfortune, but as moral failure, and in its cold arithmetic a child like Richard was a liability to be managed, not a life to be mended. The workhouse stood on the same Western Road where he would one day die, an irony history seldom spares its victims. Inside its walls, boys and men rose before dawn to break stones, pick oakum, or grind corn for hours under watchful eyes. Silence was enforced, individuality erased. Meals consisted of gruel, bread, and watered milk. Disease was constant, affection forbidden. To survive such places was to learn endurance, but it also taught another lesson, that society itself had turned its back. For Richard, it marked the beginning of a cycle he would never escape: poverty leading to crime, crime leading to imprisonment, and imprisonment leading back to poverty. When he emerged from those walls, he was no longer a boy with a chance, but a youth shaped by discipline and deprivation. The next trace of him does not surface until a decade later. The silence between 1881 and 1891 in the official record is almost total. 10 years erased, as if the city had forgotten him. But absence too speaks. For the poor, the spaces between censuses often meant wandering, sleeping rough, working odd jobs, or doing time in small local jails that left no enduring mark in the archives. By the time the 1891 census was taken, Richard had reappeared, back under his father's roof in Woodcock Street, Aston. He was 25 now, single, and listed as a hawker of green groceries. That term, deceptively modest, meant he was an itinerant street vendor, pushing a barrow piled with vegetables through the lanes of the city. It was an occupation of the margins, honest work perhaps, but irregular, offering neither shelter nor security. He had not risen from his past, he had merely learned to live within its limits. The skilled hands of his father, once employed in plating, had steadied into the routine of survival, and the family itself had changed. Catherine was gone, almost certainly dead. John had remarried a woman named Mary, and there were new children in the household. One can imagine the unspoken tension that must have hung in that small home, a returning son hardened by the streets, a father aged and remarried, the scent of loss in the air. There was no mention of his time in the workhouse, no trace of the boy who had once been a scholar, only a hawker living among half-siblings who might never have known him as the child their father once cherished. The census lists are cold documents, but between their lines the story breathes. A mother buried, a family altered, and a son returned from exile, uncertain of where he belonged. The last lines of this first act of his life, close with quiet tragedy. For all the flickers of recovery, a trade, a roof, a family name, the world he lived in was still the same one that had cast him out. The courts of Birmingham had not softened, the factory still roared, the same street still whispered with temptation and hunger. It was only a matter of time before the cycle began again, and when it did, it would do so with greater ferocity. The boy who once begged for pennies had become a man who would beg for mercy, and find none. As the years turned, Birmingham itself changed. The grand factories of Aston grew louder, the smoke thicker, and the gap between the steady worker and the street vagrant widened like a wound. For men such as Richard Fleming, there was no fixed place within this new order. He lived on the thin edge separating labour from destitution, one foot in honest trade and the other on the cobblestones of survival. The hawker's cry that once echoed with hope now carried a tremor of exhaustion. The century's closing decade would strip him of even that fragile balance. By 1901, the census shows him once more adrift, no longer with his family, but lodging at 16 Oxygen Street, a cramped house that served as a temporary refuge for men who drifted from job to job. The records list him as single, 30 years old, and still a hawker. That age, slightly younger than it should have been, hints at either neglect or indifference toward official accuracy. Many men in his position forgot their exact birthdays or simply told the enumerator whatever number came easiest. Whether from pride or confusion, the effect was the same. A man fading into anonymity, even in the government's ledgers. The world no longer saw him as a person so much as a problem. Oxygen Street itself was aptly named, a bitter joke in a city choking on industrial fumes. It lay within the heart of Aston's poorest district, a maze of lodging houses where drunks, labourers and widows crowded together in the smell of cheap gin and wet soot. The walls were thin, the floors uneven, and the rent collected weekly by landlords who rarely fixed what broke. In these rooms, men shared beds in shifts, sleeping for a few hours before being pushed out again. The lodging house served as a kind of limbo, a place for those not yet fallen enough to sleep under bridges, but too lost to ever own a key. It was from this address that the newspapers once again began to chronicle his life, this time with an almost obsessive regularity. On May 24, 1901, the Birmingham Evening Mail described a scene in Stevenson Place, a familiar corner from his childhood. The report spoke of a dirty, untidy-looking individual named Richard Fleming, aged 32, working as a news vendor. Witnesses said he deliberately pushed a woman off the pavement, sending her stumbling into the road. The court proceedings were brief and cruelly familiar. Asked for an explanation, he muttered that he must have had some beer. The magistrate noted his bad character and sent him down for a month's hard labour. It was another entry in a long list of short imprisonments that would soon define his existence. That one incident marks a turning point, the moment when Richard crossed from misfortune into notoriety. The local press, always hungry for stories that reassured the respectable classes of their own virtue, found in him a perfect villain, a scruffy drunkard, violent in his stupor, emblematic of the disorder that haunted the industrial city. The label "dirty" began to follow his name, like a shadow. Each conviction made the next one easier. Each night in jail deepened the city's contempt. He became not merely a man who broke the law, but a spectacle of what poverty was said to breed, the pattern repeated with merciless precision. On October 8, 1901, his name reappeared among 22 others charged with drunkenness. The magistrate presiding that day remarked with weary disgust that more than half the city's cases now came from the bottle. Among them stood Richard, accused of being drunk and disorderly in Summer Lane. The court clerk recorded this as his 44th appearance. It is difficult to imagine the sheer weight of that number. 44 times he had stood before a judge, sometimes fined, sometimes imprisoned, sometimes merely warned, but always returned to the same streets that ruined him. He was given another month's hard labour, another mark on a record that had long ceased to shock. Only weeks later, he was arrested yet again. This time the papers called him a man of no fixed abode, a phrase that stripped him of identity as cleanly as any sentence could. He had been caught drinking on the licensed premises of James Mace's public house on Coleshill Street. The arresting sergeant testified that Richard had been ejected from several pubs that night and warned that another incident would land him in custody. He ignored the threat, walked straight into the next bar and was immediately seized. In the brief hearing that followed, the magistrate read his file, 45 prior appearances, and imposed a fine of 10 shillings or 14 days' imprisonment. Unable to pay, Richard returned to the cells. Each incarceration was short, but the effect cumulative. With every release, his reputation spread further, until even the city's publicans knew his face. To live under such scrutiny was its own form of imprisonment. The people of Birmingham might not have remembered his youth, but they knew Dirty Dick. He was the drunk who muttered to himself at the corner of New Street, the hawker whose wares smelled of ale, the man the police carted off again and again. His descent was no longer private tragedy, but public entertainment, a serial story retold through headlines. Poverty had turned into performance, and the audience demanded regular encores. In February 1903, his name entered the city's permanent record in a way that would outlast him. On the 20th of that month, Richard Fleming was officially placed on Birmingham's register of habitual drunkards. The document survives, a sheet of paper bearing his photograph, both front and side profile. Beneath the images are the words alias Dirty Dick, Dick the Devil. He was 40 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, with a slim frame, black hair streaked with grey, blue eyes and a nose flattened by either fights or fate. His address was still 16 Oxygen Street. His occupation listed as hawker and news vendor. The charge that earned him a place on that blacklist was the same one that had haunted him for years, drunk and disorderly, and the sentence, 21 days of hard labour. To the authorities, the register was a tool of reform. Every publican and club secretary in the city received a copy and was instructed by law to refuse service to anyone named upon it. If Richard even attempted to purchase a drink, they were to summon the police immediately. In practice, it was a form of social exile. No longer could he enter a pub for shelter, for warmth, or for the simple illusion of companionship. His face, now printed and circulated, was his punishment. The following day, the Birmingham Post published the notice, ensuring that the whole city would recognise the man they had already learned to despise. The human cost of that exposure is impossible to measure, but one can imagine its weight. Each door he pushed open must have brought whispers, each glance from a passerby a flicker of disdain. In a society obsessed with cleanliness and respectability, being branded dirty was not merely insult but erasure. It meant being unworthy of sympathy, untouchable by kindness. The reformers spoke of moral uplift, but for men like Richard Fleming, the blacklist was a cage without bars, condemning them to wander streets that no longer wanted them. Over the next few years, his name appeared with monotonous regularity in the local papers. The pattern of offence barely varied: drunkenness, disorderly conduct, trespassing. Yet within that monotony lies the evidence of a man trapped in ritual, a cycle that both he and the city seemed powerless to end. The courts punished him not for any great crime, but for the persistence of his existence, as though his failure to vanish was itself an offence. Every short sentence, every fine, every scornful remark from the bench deepened his isolation. In April 1906, the Birmingham Gazette ran a headline that read, "Tank's record threatened." The article compared the criminal record of another local offender to that of Richard Fleming, who by then had accumulated 58 court appearances. The tone was almost playful, as though the competition for disgrace were a sport. They called him Dirty Dick, with the casual cruelty of familiarity, noting his latest charge, trespassing on the railway lines near New Street Station. The magistrate fined him 10 shillings, or 14 days, a sentence so routine that even the reporters wrote it without interest. What mattered was not the crime, but the continuation of the spectacle. The man himself had become irrelevant. His notoriety had taken on a life of its own. Behind those court notices lies a quieter tragedy. By this time, Richard's family ties had long dissolved. His father, once a proud tradesman, had grown old and likely ashamed of the son whose name filled the newspapers. His siblings had their own families, their own struggles, and no space for the brother who brought the police to their door. Whatever affection had once existed was buried beneath fatigue and embarrassment. The community that had raised him now crossed the street to avoid him. Even charity refused him a bed if his breath smelled of gin. By 1908, the reports grew fewer but no kinder. On November 17th, the Birmingham Evening Mail printed what would be the last story of him alive. The article began with the words, "An old offender named Richard Fleming, more familiarly Dirty Dick," and quoted the police officer's remark, "The only time he was ever known to wash was when he was sent to jail." The line drew laughter in the courtroom and snickers in the press office. Yet within that cruel jest lies the essence of his undoing, a man so reduced by drink and destitution that even hygiene became a matter for ridicule. They fined him 5 shillings for drunkenness. Unable to pay, he was sent for 7 days to Winson Green Prison, where the cells were cold but the walls, at least, were clean. It was a bitter mercy, punishment disguised as shelter. When he emerged from that final sentence, the winter air must have felt heavier than before. He was 42 now, his body weakened by years of alcohol, hunger, and exposure. The city that once gave him work and punishment now offered only oblivion. Within 3 months, he would be gone. By the opening weeks of 1909, Birmingham's winter lay heavy over its streets. The factories exhaled white steam that froze against soot-blackened walls, and the pavements glittered with frost under the thin light of gas lamps. Somewhere within that cold maze, Richard Fleming drifted between the edges of life and death. For a man who had lived most of his years beneath the open sky, the season must have felt endless. Nights too long, mornings too grey, and warmth too distant to remember. His strength, once capable of pushing a cart or hauling goods through rain, had been eroded by years of drink, hunger, and exhaustion. The city that had raised him as a child now prepared to bury him as a statistic. His final trace comes from the register of the Birmingham Workhouse Infirmary on Weston Road, the same institution that had once taken him in as a pauper boy nearly 30 years before. There is a cruel symmetry in that fact, that his beginning and his end should occur under the same roof, though separated by a lifetime of struggle. The infirmary was the quiet extension of the workhouse, a place for those too weak to labour, but not wealthy enough for healing. Inside, the wards were lined with iron bedsteads, each occupied by men whose names the world had already forgotten. The air smelled faintly of carbolic and despair. Nurses moved silently between the cots, their footsteps muffled on stone floors. Here Richard lay dying, not from a single wound, but from the slow corrosion of neglect. The death certificate, signed on February 2nd, 1909, lists the cause in words clinical, yet devastating: cardiac degeneration from alcohol, exposure, and neglect. It is a diagnosis not only of one man's body, but of an entire age. Alcohol had weakened his heart, exposure testified to his homelessness, and neglect, the most damning of all, pointed to a society that had watched him fall and done nothing to lift him. He was 42 years old, though his face likely bore the lines of someone 20 years older. The entry records his occupation as hawker, a final echo of the life he'd tried to hold on to. No family member stood by to confirm his passing. The informant was the master of the workhouse, the man responsible for signing away lives that ended quietly, without ceremony. The official notation closed the book on Richard Fleming, but not the story. For those who had mocked him in print, his death was hardly worth mention, just another forgotten drunk among hundreds who perished in the slums each year. Yet behind that indifference lies a truth the newspapers never printed. His was not an isolated tragedy, but a symptom of something vast and unseen. Victorian Birmingham, for all its factories and prosperity, had built its wealth upon the fragile bodies of men like him. They were its shadow workforce, unskilled, expendable, and always replaceable. When their hands could no longer labour they were cast aside. In this way, Richard's end was not exceptional, it was inevitable. The rhythm of his downfall mirrors the machinery of the time. Each turn of the economic wheel crushed those unable to keep pace. The workhouse, the court, the jail, all functioned as cogs within a single system designed less to heal than to control. Charity was conditional, mercy rationed. The reformers who filled pamphlets with moral advice rarely understood hunger or cold. To them, a man's failure was evidence of sin, not circumstance, and so Richard became what society expected him to be, a spectacle of disgrace, a convenient warning to others. The same papers that mocked him for filth never questioned the filth of the streets he slept in, or the wages that left thousands one missed meal from ruin. When one reads the record of his life, the pattern becomes painfully clear. The child listed as a scholar in 1871 was the same boy sent to sell matches 10 years later, the same youth confined to the workhouse, the same man labelled a drunk, and finally reduced to a line in the coroner's book. At no point does the narrative show opportunity returning, only punishment. The city had provided education, then imprisonment, then oblivion. Between those institutions lay nothing but alleys and gin shops. His tragedy, therefore, was not one of sudden collapse, but of gradual erasure, a slow fading of potential until nothing remained but habit and hunger. Within the workhouse infirmary, death was rarely dramatic. It came quietly, as patients slipped into sleep and failed to wake. The nurses, used to such endings, would draw the sheet over the face and record the hour. For most, no relatives claimed the body. Burials took place in common ground, several to a grave, the names penciled briefly into a registry before being lost to damp and time. Richard's resting place is unmarked, swallowed by the soil of Birmingham's municipal cemetery. No stone bears his name, no flowers mark the anniversary of his death. Yet through the records that survive, his voice endures faintly, echoing through census pages, court transcripts, and the yellowed columns of old newspapers. Each line restores a fragment of the man the city once refused to see. If one retraces his steps, from Great Court to Coleman Street, from Oxygen Street to Winson Green, the geography of his life forms a map of confinement. Every address lies within a few miles, as though invisible chains bound him to the same few streets, from birth to death. The illusion of movement masked a terrible stillness. He wandered constantly, but never escaped the orbit of poverty. For him, the city was both world and prison, familiar, suffocating, inescapable. His story is not of adventure, but of repetition, the endless loop of a survival that defines those forgotten by progress. The phrase "Dirty Dick" survives, in print longer than the man who bore it. Reporters continued to invoke it for years afterward, whenever they needed to colour an article with local infamy. They never spoke of Richard Fleming, the child who once sat in a classroom, or the young man who tried to sell vegetables door to door. The nickname consumed the person. It became shorthand for failure, a moral fable whispered to apprentices and schoolchildren. Yet the truth beneath it is far more human. His dirt was not vice but circumstance, the grime of streets that offered no bath, the residue of survival against odds too heavy to name. The city's judgment, cloaked in respectability, was a mirror of its own cruelty. To understand Richard's fate is to glimpse the machinery of the age that made him. Victorian England, for all its sermons about self-improvement, created entire populations it could neither employ nor forgive. The factories demanded perfection, the poor supplied imperfection. In this equation, failure was inevitable. Men like Richard drank not out of joy, but to numb the emptiness between one punishment and the next. Each arrest provided food and warmth. Each release delivered them back into the cold. The law called it justice. History recognizes it as abandonment. And yet, even amid despair, there remains something hauntingly dignified about his endurance. He lived through hunger, imprisonment, ridicule, an exile, and still continued to breathe the city's smoke until his heart could bear no more. To survive 42 years in that world without vanishing entirely was its own quiet defiance. His name, preserved by bureaucrats and journalists alike, outlasted the factories that once scorned him. The poor rarely leave monuments, but records have a way of keeping their ghosts alive. When historians look back upon these fragments, they see more than one man's descent. They see the anatomy of a system that valued labour more than life. The censuses and police logs, read together, reveal an unbroken chain of poverty, stretching across generations. For every Richard Fleming, there were dozens unseen, boys who slipped into the same pattern, mothers who buried their children beneath unmarked stones, fathers who watched their trades vanish beneath the weight of mechanization. Their names may not survive, but their stories echo through his. As for the question of when it all went wrong, there may be no single answer. Some would say it began the day his father's wages fell short, forcing his mother to send him into the streets. Others might point to that first arrest in Stevenson Place, when the court chose punishment over compassion. Perhaps it began earlier still, within the architecture of a society that mistook discipline for virtue and poverty for guilt. Each step led inevitably to the next, like links in a chain too strong for any one man to break. By the time the city buried him, the streets had already forgotten the boy who once ran through them barefoot, calling out the day's headlines. Only the echo of his nickname remained, whispered by those who never knew his face. Yet if one listens closely, beneath the rustle of archives and the hum of modern traffic, there lingers the faint murmur of that lost life. A reminder that history is built not only from triumph, but from endurance. The same hands that once turned a coin in a game of pitch and toss now rest in silence. Their story told not in victory, but in survival against a world too hard to care. Richard Fleming's journey, from scholar to pauper, from worker to outcast, from laughter in the courtroom to the hush of the infirmary, stands as both warning and witness. It reveals what happens when a city grows richer than its people, when progress forgets compassion, and when judgment becomes easier than help. His end, though lonely, forces the question no newspaper dared to ask. What if the failure was not his but everyone's? After his burial, Birmingham moved on as if he had never existed. The presses that once mocked him turned their ink toward new scandals, new victims, and fresher tragedies, yet the city could not quite let go of the legend it had made. The name Dirty Dick lingered like soot on brick, repeated in pubs, retold by constables, and whispered by journalists who had never met the man. Within a decade his life had hardened into anecdote, the cautionary ghost of the gin-soaked poor. To speak it aloud was to invoke the smell of alleyways, the creak of the lodging-house bed, the laughter that rose whenever the destitute stumbled. In this way, the living kept his humiliation alive long after the grave had sealed him. Edwardian Birmingham wanted to believe it was better than the Victorian slum that preceded it. Electric trams glided along polished rails, and department stores rose where courts once stood. Yet beneath that varnish, the same indifference remained. Reformers spoke earnestly of social improvement, while workers queued for bread at mission halls. Every step toward progress carried its shadow, and the forgotten like Richard became the moral ballast that let the respectable sleep at night. He had been condemned not simply for drinking, but for refusing to pretend that poverty could be noble. His body was gone, but the myth of his filth offered a kind of civic reassurance, proof that the righteous still knew who the sinners were. In the archives, his file rested quietly among hundreds of others. Each folder carried the same mixture of census slips, police notes, and death certificates. Few readers paused long enough to imagine the lives those papers once described. Yet anyone who did would find a pattern of mechanical cruelty, a procession of arrests, brief imprisonments, and returns to the same streets. The paperwork gave the illusion of control, as though bureaucracy itself could redeem what compassion had refused to touch. But every document was merely another brick in the wall that kept men like him confined to invisibility. The system recorded everything and understood nothing. Across Britain, similar stories unfolded in every industrial town. Liverpool had its drunks of the docks, Manchester its tramps beneath the viaducts, Glasgow its women hawking newspapers in the rain. Society labelled them vagrants, the press called them nuisances, and the courts named them offenders. Each city needed its outcasts, figures upon whom it could project anxiety and blame. When reformers printed pamphlets on temperance, they illustrated them with men like Richard Fleming, their hollow cheeks warning the middle class of what happened to the undisciplined. The moral economy depended on such imagery. Misery became metaphor, and poverty a lesson for others to study rather than a wound to heal. The cruelty lay not only in punishment, but in narration. Newspapers turned suffering into performance, reducing entire lives to paragraphs between advertisements for patent tonics and corsets. In those pages, tragedy became entertainment, and the audience consumed despair as though it were a civic duty. The reporters who described Richard's unwashed face never considered the waterless courtyards he had lived in. They praised reform while condemning the reformed. Their pens offered sympathy only to those who had already survived. The rest were reminders, disposable evidence that the world still contained failure. If one could step back into those streets, one would see how inevitable his end truly was. The workhouse loomed over Western Road like a fortress of moral order, its tall chimneys visible for miles. Men lined up at its gates at dawn, hoping for bread or shelter, knowing that each entry cost a fragment of dignity. Inside, the silence was a sermon. The poor were expected to learn gratitude for the minimal mercy of confinement. Outside, preachers urged repentance, landlords demanded rent, and employers sought pliant hands. The cycle turned with perfect efficiency, fueled by fear of becoming the next Dirty Dick. Yet, despite the cruelty of his reputation, fragments of compassion occasionally surfaced. A letter printed anonymously in an early 20th century local paper lamented how the man they called Dirty Dick was once a lad of promise. The writer, perhaps an old neighbour or distant relative, described seeing him as a boy carrying newspapers with a laugh brighter than the morning itself. The letter ended abruptly, unsigned, but it stands as a tiny act of rebellion, a refusal to let mockery be the final word. It suggests that memory, even when battered by gossip, still held space for pity. Such moments are rare, but they matter. They show that beneath society's hardness, the impulse to mourn had not completely died. By 1910, Birmingham began modernising its record systems. Old ledgers were transferred to new offices, and many minor case files were destroyed to save space. Richard's mugshot, pressed between thick pages of the habitual drunkard register, survived only because it formed part of a statistical study. Scholars, decades later, would rediscover it, puzzled by the faint smile on his worn face. That expression, neither defiant nor submissive, became the only surviving portrait of the man behind the myth. In its grainy blur lies a strange serenity, as though he understood something the society around him did not. That condemnation is temporary, but endurance leaves traces. The reform movements that followed claimed victory over the vice of drunkenness, yet the new century produced its own versions of the same despair. Factories closed, wars filled hospitals, and soldiers returned home to unemployment. The name Dirty Dick faded, but his condition persisted under other guises. The lodging houses changed names, the gin shops became pubs with electric light. Yet in every decade, the poor still walked the same cold streets. What differed was only the language used to describe them. Where Victorians saw moral weakness, modern observers spoke of social failure. Either way, the result remained. People abandoned, recorded, and forgotten. Historians who later pieced together Richard's life found themselves wrestling with a moral dilemma. To retell his story risked repeating the voyeurism of the newspapers that had mocked him. Yet silence would erase him again. The only honest approach was to let the records speak while acknowledging the cruelty of the gaze that created them. Through that method, the modern reader can sense the heartbeat behind the statistics, the quiet persistence of a human being crushed but never fully erased. The boy who once held a slate, the youth who hawked fruit, the man who laughed drunkenly in court. But they are all one continuum of existence, stitched together by the city's neglect. In this light, his story becomes less about failure and more about revelation. It exposes the moral arithmetic by which society balanced progress against empathy. Every factory that glittered with invention drew power from unseen suffering. Every reform speech built its rhetoric on the corpses of those it pretended to rescue. The tale of Richard Fleming thus becomes a mirror, reflecting not his shame, but the community's. His dirt clung to the conscience of the city long after the cobblestones were cleaned. There is a certain poetic justice in how history preserved him. While the names of magistrates and landlords have vanished into forgotten registries, his survives in digital archives, searchable and studied. The man once considered waste now instructs scholars, students, and storytellers. Each retelling strips away another layer of scorn, replacing it with understanding. What once served as moral warning has become moral evidence, proof that judgment without compassion breeds ruin. Walking through modern Birmingham, one can still trace the outlines of his world. Great Court is gone, replaced by warehouses. Oxygen Street lies buried beneath new developments. The workhouse has become part of a hospital complex, its wards filled with antiseptic light instead of coal smoke. Yet if you stand there at dusk, you can almost imagine his shadow crossing the road, short, stooped, and persistent. The noise of the city blurs into something timeless. Footsteps on wet pavement, the rustle of a newspaper, the echo of a name shouted by those who never understood it. Such ghosts do not demand pity, they demand remembrance. To recall Richard Fleming is to confront the ease with which societies discard their inconvenient citizens. His life demonstrates that cruelty often wears the mask of order, and that indifference can be more lethal than hate. The repetition of his arrests, the laughter in the courtroom, the silence of the infirmary, together they form a litany not of sin but of neglect. Each line written about him by the press was another nail in a coffin built from ignorance. When the archives finally close on his name, the story that remains is strangely luminous. It teaches that history's true subjects are not kings or inventors, but those who bore the weight of their age without recognition. Richard's existence, stripped of glory, forces us to ask who we become when compassion is reserved only for the successful. His is not the tale of a drunkard, but of a system that mistook despair for defiance. He lived exactly as long as society allowed, and died exactly where it expected him to. And still, against every attempt at erasure, his record endures. That endurance is the quiet triumph no headline could distort. Each preserved photograph, each fading newspaper column, each re-examined census entry ensures that his name continues to surface, reminding us that the line between respectability and ruin is perilously thin. The man they mocked as Dirty Dick remains, in the end, the city's most honest historian. Through him, Birmingham's conscience still speaks, not through sermons, but through the undeniable evidence of one forgotten life that refused to disappear. History does not always choose its witnesses. Sometimes it simply leaves them behind, buried in the margins of official records until the world stumbles upon them again. Richard Fleming's name, scribbled across court ledgers and death registers, was never meant to survive more than a generation. Yet against all expectation, it did. Through the bureaucratic precision of Victorian paperwork, the boy who once hawked matches on Stevenson Place, still whispers across time. His story, pieced together from dust and ink, endures not because of fame, but because neglect itself became documentation. In the silence of forgotten archives, his voice remained waiting for someone to listen. When viewed as a whole, his life reads like a mirror held up to an entire century's conscience. Every stage of his existence reflects the social fabric that wove him and then tore him apart. His birth amid the smoke of Birmingham's workshops, his education promised by reformers, his fall through poverty's cracks, his humiliation in print, each event reveals the contradictions of an empire that prided itself on progress while feeding upon the exhaustion of its workers. The Victorian dream of respectability demanded that everyone climb, but provided ladders only for a few. Those who slipped were blamed for the fall. Richard's misfortune, therefore, was not deviance but the inevitable consequence of a system that mistook survival for sin. The newspapers that once caricatured him believed they were chronicling vice, not tragedy. Their readers found comfort in the notion that men like him existed because they deserved to, proof that moral order remained intact. Yet what the papers never printed was the invisible labour that shaped such destinies. The long shifts his father endured in furnaces, the cramped courtyards where children slept beside barrels of soot, the hunger that gnawed through respectability's thin facade. By isolating Richard as an example of degradation, society absolved itself. The act of naming him Dirty Dick allowed everyone else to stay clean. But behind that illusion lay the truth that his story was simply the public face of countless private miseries. Every generation invents new versions of the same cruelty. Where Victorians spoke of moral failure, later ages spoke of irresponsibility, addiction, or broken homes. The language changed, but the sentiment endured, a refusal to see the individual within the statistic. Yet the existence of records like his stands as quiet resistance to that blindness. The very documents that condemned him now expose the machinery of judgment. They reveal how easily compassion can be replaced by process, how quickly empathy evaporates when poverty is treated as pathology. Richard's life, once used to justify punishment, has become evidence against it. To imagine his final days is to confront the intimate texture of despair. The infirmary's ward, dimly lit by oil lamps, would have echoed with the coughs of dying men. The walls smelled of disinfectant and stale bread. He would have heard the creak of carts outside, the distant hum of a city too busy to remember him. Perhaps he thought of his mother, who once defended him before a magistrate. Perhaps he remembered his father's rough hands or the laughter of his sister Rose, long gone. No record captures those thoughts, but they must have existed, if only as flickers in a failing mind. Death did not come with ceremony, no priest, no family, no friend to close his eyes. Yet the simple act of recording his name ensured that oblivion would never be total. Modern readers might be tempted to romanticize such endurance, to imagine redemption hidden somewhere within the suffering. But Richard's story offers no such comfort. It does not end with transformation or forgiveness. It ends with exposure. His life lays bare the structural cruelty of a world that prized moral order above mercy. There is no redemption in starvation, no lesson in humiliation. The only grace that remains lies in remembrance itself, in the act of refusing to let his existence dissolve into abstraction. To tell his story honestly is to strip away every convenient moral and stand face to face with the indifference that created him. If one listens carefully, his voice still echoes through the architecture of modern cities. The narrow alleys may have been paved, the workhouses demolished, yet the rhythm of exclusion persists in quieter forms. Homeless shelters echo with the same fatigue that once filled the infirmary. Cheap hostels still divide beds between those who can pay and those who cannot. The labels have changed, but the judgment remains. society continues to categorize lives into worth and unworthiness, cleanliness and contamination, redemption and failure. In every era, the same pattern repeats. Progress built upon selective blindness. Richard Fleming's life invites us to look beyond that blindness. It demands that we see poverty not as spectacle, but as inheritance passed down through systems that mistake punishment for protection. His story reminds us that behind every derelict face lies an entire history of unmet potential. The boy marked as a scholar in 1871 carried within him the same intelligence as any child in a classroom today. The difference was not talent, but circumstance. A few missed meals, a father's lost job, a city's indifference. In this way, his tragedy becomes universal. It could have been anyone. It could still be anyone. The enduring power of his tale lies in its ordinariness. There is nothing heroic in it, nothing dramatic beyond endurance itself. Yet that very ordinariness is what grants it truth. For every empire that celebrates its inventors and generals, there are millions of unseen lives that made those victories possible. Workers, mothers, children, wanderers. Richard stands among them as an emblem of all who laboured and were forgotten. His suffering, recorded unintentionally by clerks and constables, has outlasted the speeches of the men who condemned him. That endurance transforms him from outcast to witness. Through his silence, history speaks. Each document, once meant to mark his failure, now testifies to the failure of the society that created it. The repetitive rhythm of his arrests becomes a drumbeat, exposing the emptiness of reform. His photograph, intended for identification, becomes a portrait of resistance, a man refusing to disappear entirely, even when the world insists he must. The survival of that image across centuries suggests that memory itself sometimes chooses differently than those in power. The archives kept what compassion discarded. Standing before that photograph, one cannot help but wonder how many others vanished without trace. Men whose faces were never captured, women whose names never made it to paper, children whose brief lives ended before a census could list them. Their silence is the background hum behind Richard's solitary voice. To honour him is to acknowledge them all, the innumerable forgotten who built the foundations of modern life. His presence in history's margins serves as a reminder that empathy is not a luxury of the fortunate, but a duty owed to the invisible. There is a peculiar beauty in how his memory survives. It does not ask for forgiveness or pity. It asks only for recognition. The act of reading his story, of tracing his name through centuries of dust, is itself an act of restoration. Each retelling rescues him from the contempt that once defined him. In that sense, time performs its own quiet justice, turning mockery into testimony, insult into insight. The man labelled unclean becomes the mirror through which we measure our humanity. If the city that buried him could speak now, perhaps it would whisper an apology. It might acknowledge that progress built on exclusion is no progress at all, that the true measure of civilization lies not in its monuments, but in the dignity it affords the least remembered. Birmingham's skyline gleams with towers of glass, yet beneath their reflection lies the shadow of the courts and workhouses that once confined its poor. That shadow is not shame, it is warning. It asks us never to forget that behind every triumph of industry stands a multitude of exhausted souls who paid the unseen cost. Richard Fleming's life closes like a lantern burning low, its light faint but enduring. He left behind no descendants, no possessions, no legacy of invention or wealth. What he left was a fragment of truth, preserved in the accidental kindness of history's record keepers. That truth speaks for everyone who has been named, shamed, and discarded. It insists that no life is too small to echo, that even the most forgotten can still alter the conscience of the living. So when his name reappears in an archive, when a researcher pauses over his faded signature, or when his story is retold in words such as these, the cycle of silence breaks. Each remembrance grants him a moment of dignity denied in life. Through memory, the pauper stands beside the powerful, and the court jester of history becomes its chronicler. His existence becomes a testament that endurance itself is a form of grace, not loud, not heroic, but quietly unyielding. In the end, the boy from Great Court who once sold matches in the streets achieved something the world never intended. He became unforgettable. His life, once dismissed as waste, transformed into a mirror that forces every age to confront its compassion. And though his body lies beneath unmarked soil, his story walks the city still, unseen, uncelebrated, but alive in every conscience willing to remember. There are names the world never intended to remember, yet somehow they endure. Richard Fleming was one of them. His existence, scribbled across police ledgers and forgotten ledgers, was supposed to vanish with the turning of each new century. And still, his shadow clings to the cobblestones of Birmingham, like a faint reflection of the people who built it and were broken by it. Time has swept away the courts where he once stood, erased the rooms where he shivered, and silenced the laughter that once followed his downfall. Yet every document that bears his name becomes an act of resurrection, proof that the poor do not disappear just because the rich forget their faces. To walk through that city now is to move through layers of memory. Beneath the sound of cars and voices lies the pulse of a place that once measured morality by cleanliness, virtue by obedience, and worth by wealth. It was a world that believed poverty was contagious and compassion a weakness. The workhouses may have closed, their iron gates rusted and repurposed, but their echo remains in every narrow alley and every stranger ignored. When you trace the path from Brook Street to Western Road, you trace not merely the life of one man, but the anatomy of an age. His journey maps the geography of indifference, from childhood promise to adult disgrace, from a scholar's slate to a pauper's grave. What his story leaves behind is not despair, but understanding. It reveals that the boundary between ruin and respectability was never as wide as the respectable wished to believe. The men who condemned him drank their own gin behind closed doors. The judges who lectured him on discipline grew fat on taxes paid by the very workers they imprisoned. The city that called him dirty was itself coated in the soot of its own making. Yet through all that hypocrisy, something human survived, a faint spark of endurance that neither court nor cell could extinguish. It is that spark, not his shame, that survives in the telling. The beauty of history lies in its refusal to obey the living. Those who once ruled its pages fade first. Their speeches crumble, their monuments erode. What remains are fragments, the photograph of a forgotten man, the line of ink that records a life's last breath. In these remnants lies the truest record of humanity. Through them we learn that greatness does not belong only to those who conquered or created, but also to those who simply endured. Richard Fleming never sought recognition, yet by surviving long enough to be seen again, he achieved a strange kind of immortality. His life, stripped of comfort, became a testament to every soul swallowed by progress, and remembered only when someone cared enough to ask who they were. As night falls over modern Birmingham, the streets he once walked glow beneath electric light. The smoke that once choked the air has thinned, and the hum of engines has replaced the clatter of horse hooves. But if you pause in the stillness between those sounds, you might sense him there, not as a ghost, but as a presence woven into the city's breath. The boy who sold matches, the man who fell, the pauper who died alone. All of them live in the rhythm of footsteps and the hum of the crowd. The city that forgot him continues to whisper his name, not in ridicule, but in quiet acknowledgement that even its darkest corners once held a beating heart. And so his story ends where it began, not with the cruelty of mockery, but with the gentleness of remembrance. History, at its most honest, is an act of listening. To remember Richard Fleming is to hear the sound of those who had no voice. It is to stand amid the ruins of judgment and recognise that the measure of a civilization is not written in its wealth or its buildings, but in how it remembers its poor. He may have died alone, unnamed and unwashed, yet in the long silence that followed, time chose to keep him. And perhaps that is enough, for in the quiet that lingers after the final page, one truth remains: the forgotten never vanish. They wait, in archives, in memories, in the conscience of every heart still capable of mercy, until someone chooses to look back. And when that gaze falls upon their names, they rise again, not as warnings, but as witnesses. Richard Fleming stands among them still, not as a man lost to disgrace, but as a testament to the endurance of the human soul, fragile, defiant, and unforgettable. When the story ends and the city grows quiet, the noise of history softens until only one sound remains: the faint heartbeat of the forgotten. It is there, beneath the hum of progress, beneath the rhythm of footsteps and machinery, that the memory of Richard Fleming continues to breathe. His name, once printed to provoke laughter, now rests like a fragile leaf between the pages of time. The world that mocked him has vanished, its factories dismantled, its judges long buried, yet the trace of the man they called Dirty Dick endures in the stillness that follows their absence. Every era leaves behind its own silence. For Birmingham, that silence was filled with the echo of the poor, men and women whose labour built the city's foundations, but whose suffering was hidden beneath them. Their stories did not make history books. They lived instead in ledger columns and police reports, surviving only because bureaucracy could not help but record what compassion refused to see. It is through those records that Richard lives again, his existence no longer a spectacle of shame, but a lesson in endurance. Each time his name is read, the city he once haunted becomes accountable to itself. There is an intimacy in the act of remembrance, a quiet defiance in refusing to let a single life vanish without acknowledgement. To speak his name now is to repair, in some small way, the neglect that defined him. It turns a mockery into a memorial, transforming one man's despair into collective reflection. For every photograph faded by age, for every ink-stained entry that marks his imprisonment, there is now a reader who pauses, a witness he never had in life. Through that pause, history finds its conscience again. Perhaps that is the hidden mercy in all this, that the very systems designed to erase emotion inadvertently preserved it. The census, the court, the workhouse, institutions of order and control became the reluctant guardians of memory. They wrote down his presence to measure his failure, and by doing so, they ensured that failure could never be fully buried. In this irony lies his redemption. The empire that condemned him to obscurity left instead a trail of evidence testifying that he existed, suffered, and mattered. As the centuries move forward, the image of Richard Fleming no longer belongs to the world that shamed him. It belongs to those who understand what it means to be unseen, to the labourer whose name will never appear in history, to the wanderer who walks through cities unnoticed, to the quiet observer who recognises fragments of him in every neglected face. His story no longer belongs to the courts or the newspapers. It belongs to the hearts capable of empathy, the listeners who choose not to look away. The lesson he leaves behind is not one of pity, but of awareness. It asks a question that every age must answer. How many lives must be lost before compassion becomes instinct? The men who built the prisons believed they were maintaining order. The writers who filled the newspapers believed they were reporting truth. The citizens who turned their heads believed they were preserving dignity. Yet in the end, all that survives are their errors, and the faint outline of a man who bore them without revenge. What remains of Richard Fleming is not sorrow but perspective. His life is the measure by which we test the worth of our humanity. He forces us to see that civilization's greatness is not carved in monuments or measured in progress, but in the tenderness it extends toward its most wounded. A society that cannot remember its poor has learned nothing from its past. A city that cannot speak the names of those it failed is not proud. It is incomplete. So the story closes not with triumph, but with understanding. The same streets that once cast him out now whisper his legacy in their quiet corners. Somewhere, under the pulse of streetlights, the ghost of that small boy from Great Court still lingers, not as a warning, but as a guide. His voice, once drowned by ridicule, now speaks softly through the archives, reminding us that compassion is history's only real victory. When the lights fade and the narration falls to silence, his name will remain, faint but indelible. Richard Fleming, the child who dreamed, the man who fell, the soul who endured. His life, once measured in punishments, now measures us. And as the last line closes and the screen turns dark, only one truth continues to echo in the stillness: that no one who lived, suffered, and was seen is ever truly forgotten.